To part 5 of the Chertsey Radio Club Build-a-thon. Tonight we'll be looking at the power amplifier and filter, which is essentially the last stage that we do on this board before we connect the keyer circuit up to it. What you should have in your bag is a selection of bits and pieces. Some of these polystyrene capacitors, which we don't get to work with very often. The usual selection of ceramics. You'll also have some of these ferrite beads and rings, or 1 ferrite bead and 3 ferrite rings with any luck, and our output transistor, its little heatsink, and 3 or 4 rolls of insulated cable, insulated wire. And what we're going to start by doing is fitting the capacitor set, and then I'll show you how to wind these toroids to make an inductor, which will be quite fiddly and time consuming. Right then, let's have a look at our capacitor set first. Now we're going to start with C26, which is this little fellow down here, which is 100 nanofarad, so it's a 104. It's going to be one of these two here. With any luck, that's a 104, and I think this probably is as well. Yeah, okay. C26. Just a quick reminder there, C25 is not used. It was effectively would have been on the last stage if we'd had to use it, but we don't. So ignore C25 and we fit C26 and C27. So just pop that one in there first of all. Grubby iron today, not a good start. Right. Okay. 26 in, 27 goes in and just above it. Right, they're in there. Now we can have a look at our polystyrene capacitors. I need my magnifier here to identify them because I think they're all different values more or less. I know that there are 2 that are the same. Right, we want 270 C28. Let's try and find it. So 680. That looks like our 270. C28. Yeah, okay. C28. I think these are going to be a vertically mounted effort by the looks of things. Yeah, so we'll take that one. And I'm going to try and orientate them so that the body of the capacitor is sort of like that. So the lead's at the front and the body points towards the back. Try and leave us as much room as we can for the three toroids when we come to put them in. Now these polystyrene capacitors are a little bit like the ceramic ones. There's no polarity to worry about. The hardest thing to do will be to make them stay in position whilst we get them soldered, because they're see how that's taken. It's not too bad. Try and keep them nice and vertical if we can. Right, so let's see C28 in position. We now want C29, which is one of the 680s. So yeah, that's a 680. Take this for the best position. I think it's going to be there. Yeah. You have to be careful with these, because when you solder them in position they try and spread the solder bead over onto the next door contact pad for the inductor, and we don't want to fill that hole just yet. So, right, so we'll look at our next one. C30, that's the other 680. That's that one there. Okay. I'm not a big fan of these polystyrene capacitors. They don't look terribly neat, but they do the job. Yes, I actually think they're quite ugly, but that's just me. One more to fit. C31, that's 270 picofarads, that's 31, yep, one at the far end here, next to the antenna connector. Use both grips. Okay, that's the 4 of those in place. Let's see what comes up next. Our main transistor, our output transistor. Now, this little fella is orientated by that little notch on there. Sorry mate, have you got that? Right. And if you have a look on the board there, it's shown having a little notch on the side, so they should, with any luck, line up quite nicely. Yes, look at that. That's the important thing, we must get him the right way around. Try and be fairly quick with this because they don't like heat particularly. That's good. Right, I'm quite tempted to put the heatsink on that now. You could leave it until the end, but I think I'll pop that on. Should be orientated that way around with the gap pointing towards the left hand side. There we go. That's good, that's a nice firm fit, like that. Okay, now once that's on, the next thing we need to have a look at is winding our inductors. Now this will take some time, it's not something you want to rush, and it will probably be the most tricky part of the entire build for those of you that don't have a great deal of building radios before now, but we'll do it one step at a time, and hopefully with any luck it will all go smoothly. Right, if we could hold it. Now this is what will probably prove to be the most tricky part of this radio build. This is basically winding our 4 inductors that form the low pass filter for the output transistor. Now the first one we're going to tackle will be the worst one of the lot. So it involves this little ferrite bead here and the finer gauge wire which you should have in your kit, which is the red stuff. You'll be able to tell because the other stuff is simply enamelled copper. And what we need to do is to put 14 turns onto this bead. Now a thing you need to remember when winding ferrites is every time the wire passes through the core of the ferrite like that, that counts as a turn. So even though we haven't completed a loop around it, that is technically turn 1. So when we actually come to put it through again, like so, that is in fact turn 2. Now what you need to do is to try and take as much slack out of this as you can. Don't pull it too tight because this is the finer wire, and if you get too hefty with it, it will snap. And what we need to do now is to put another 12 turns around this ferrite. Now it'll be quite difficult to do that on this without overlapping them. Do your best. If you do overlap a couple, it's not so critical. It's when we do the next set of inductors where the overlapping is important that it's avoided. Right then, let's see if we can make a start. So this is actually turn 3. try and keep the links close together so we can squeeze them together like that. Comes 4. Number 5. Six. 10. 11. 'That's it. So 14 turns. Now I'll try and space them out a little bit, but if you've got one or two overlapping, it'll be difficult to undo this. But basically that is what you want to end up with. Now what we can do is just snip the excess off here, like so. Now what we've got to do is to tin these leads up to the toroid on either side. Now this enamelled wire can take a while to burn through, so it will take. If you've got a gas soldering iron, now is the time to turn it up to maximum. If you haven't, it'll just take a little bit longer. So I'm going to fill this up and see what we can do. There we go. Now what you need to do is get a nice blob of solder on the end of the iron, and then slowly aim to work it up and down the wire. Once you've burnt the enamel off, you'll know, because the solder will start to take on the wire. This may take a couple of minutes. And this is where your soldering mat will come in very handy, because you will get blobs of solder everywhere doing this. It's quite difficult to do it and avoid that happening, so be prepared. Okay. Now I'm actually tinning more wire here than we really need to, but see, this is actually coming off quite easily, but then this is the finer gauge of wire, so it will probably go a little bit quicker than the other stuff. Okay, that's what we want. Now let's wind this down a second. Now what we have to do is just with a fingernail, just clean off any rubbish on there, like that. Okay. Now there we have our first completed toroid to go onto the board. Now this is L2, which is tucked away over here between the output transistor and our row of polystyrene capacitors. It's just a winding, so there's no, doesn't matter which way round it goes in. It'll be a little bit of a fiddle. I mean, I could have cut these legs a lot shorter than this, but what I did actually put that, it goes into there like that. What I'm going to do actually is just see if I can move a couple of those. Spacing is a little okay. Right. Once he's in, we can. Now, I've seen people wind these in the past and solder them onto the board, and what they chose to do was not to tin the wire up until this point here. Now, the problem with that is that because it takes a while to burn that enamel off, what can happen is that whilst you're trying to do it, the track on the board will overheat, and you can actually lift the track clean off the underside of the board. And that's why it's important to tin them before we fit them, and then they'll solder just like any regular component. Now that is probably going to be the worst one of the lot that he's done now. I may just get us something non-conductive and try and neaten those coils up a little bit, but that's purely an aesthetic thing from my point. Now the next thing we'll start to have a look at is our larger toroids. Well, I say larger, they're not a great deal larger, but they'll be less troublesome than that one with any luck. Now we're going to have a look at winding our 3 inductors. I'll show you how to do one of these, and then you can have a little practice and make a start. Now they've conveniently cut the wire already for us. Most important thing when you do these is to first of all untangle the wire and get it nice and straight so you don't have any kinks in it, because this stuff does have a tendency to kink, and it's an absolute nuisance when it does it. Now, same as when we're winding the bead, every time it goes through the core, like so, that counts as a turn. So what I'll say is, Now I'm going to wind this one from left to right, going round that way. That's because I'm left-handed. You might find it easier to wind it right to left. It doesn't make any difference. The most important thing is you do them all the same way. And at the end of it, we'll have a look at evening the spacings out between the windings. What you'll want to consider when it's finished, the copper should cover about 3/4 of the toroid. So what we'll do is we'll go and put our 19 turns on, and then we'll have a look at neatening it up once we're done. So that's number 2. With this one you can pull it a little bit tighter because it's a heavier gauge of wire. And the other thing with these is you want to make sure we don't overlap any of the windings. It's more critical with these than it was with the bead that we've just done. So there we have 1, 2, 3. I've just got one of those famous kinks that I've been forewarning you about. That's what it'll do. Now, under normal circumstances this would make me swear, but I'm going to be good today. So it happens to the best of us. In the process of doing this I've lost count as well. So we'll have to just double check what we've got on here so far. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Turns. What I want to try and do now is just try and get them evenly spaced if we can. It doesn't have to be perfect, but just as best you can by eye. With any luck, if you pulled it reasonably tight, it should be quite a nice firm fit on the toroid. It shouldn't flop about or have any loops poking out. Right, what I'm going to do Just pause there and just double check my my windings. I want 19 turns. That's counted from the inside of the toroid, not the outside. It's easy to count it by from the outside, and then you end up putting on one extra turn that you don't want. So what we'll do is we'll just pause there and make sure that we've got it right before we move on to tinning the two leads. Okay, now what we'll do is we're going to tin these just like we did with the ferrite bead. Now this is a little bit heavier, this wire. It'll probably take a fraction longer to do. Certainly if we're using an electric iron, it will take a little bit longer, because you don't always, well, some of them have the temperature control, but most of them you can't bang the temperature up, which is really what you need for this. If it starts to smoke like crazy, that's a good sign that the enamel's coming off. And you want to take this right up to the bottom of the bead. One. Okay. Cool down a second. Just run the fingernail down it just to clean off any residue. Okay, now this is our first 19 turn inductor, which goes in position of L3. That's the first one here on the left hand side. Now, what we're going to do is just try and pop them through the two little holes there. Now with any luck, it should fit, be held in place fairly closely between those couple of capacitors. Okay. Doesn't matter if those two join together there, because they're on the same pad. That's nicely in position. Yeah, I'm quite pleased with that. The spacing's nice and even. That's what we're looking for. An even gap as possible between the turns. Now, the next one we're going to do is L4, which is the 21 turn. The 21 turn inductor. Now, as in all good recorded programs, I'm going to make you all cringe by saying, here's one I made earlier. Now, the only difference I've done here is I put a blob of epoxy on it to stop it coming unwound, because the more turns you put on there, the more likely it is to come undone. So L4 is the 21 turn toroid. Yes, it is 21 turns. And that is this fella. So like I said, take your time when you do these, because you want to get them nice and neat and nice even spacing. So this little fella is now ready to go in position of L4 there. Last one going is L5, which is again 19 turns like L3, which I have conveniently tucked away over here. Now I'm quite happy to admit, when I first wound these, I did it incorrectly and I put one turn too many on, and I did this by counting them around the outside of the toroid instead of the inside. That's how easy it is to get it wrong. So this one has now been corrected, and it is 19 turns, and it will go in position of L5 down the end here. At least it will. I'll get the legs in the right position. Better. Nothing like putting one in back to front. I'm just being a little bit pedantic about them being straight. It's just something I have a thing about. Okay, good. That's our three inductors in position. The last thing we have to fit is the antenna connector. It's over here on the right hand side. Yeah. You can position this whichever way you like, whether you want the two locking pins horizontal or vertical. It doesn't really matter. personal preference. I think I'm going to go with vertical. Now, this little fella will almost certainly try and fall out. So, I'm just going to lay this on the board for this, because otherwise, as soon as I try and grip it on there, it'll be out. Take a minute to get these to take, because it's the connector quite quickly draws the heat away from the pad. Yeah, that's taken quite nicely. Yeah, and that's cooled down. We'll have a look at testing it and see what we've got in the way of an output. Okay, now what we need to do now is move on to test the output stage of our finished radio. Now what I've got here is a nice little swell meter with a dummy load attached to the back, and then obviously our lead to our Fox 3 radio. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to plug in the power supply, and then what we'll do is, since I don't currently have my key set up, what we're going to do is we'll short those two terminals there on COM 3, and that will flip the radio over into transmit, and we should have a reading on our meter there. I'm just going to pop this back a little bit so we can read it. So we'll power it up. Just for information purposes, this is a 12 volt LiPo that I'm running it off at the moment, but I've found with these little radios, they run so much better off a battery than a power supply because there's very little filtering. Although that said, this one does have some filtering. So we'll short this now and we'll see what we get on an output. There we go, just a fraction over 500 milliwatts, so that's probably about 600 milliwatts, which isn't bad for the supplied settings. If you want to change it, you can adjust the value of this resistor here, the one that's marked adjust on test. Currently it's 220 ohms. I wouldn't drop it by probably more than about 50 or 60 ohms. I mean, you should be able to get the power output up to around about 1 watt, but don't try and push it over 1 watt, because that will almost certainly do fatal damage to the output transistor. But as it stands, that is working. So what we have to do next, and we'll be doing next week, is looking to connect up our Kia circuit to it, which of course is this little fella here that you made the other week, and we can see if we can get the two talking to each other. So that's it for stage 5, and hopefully I will catch you all in stage 6. I hope you have a successful build. Like I said, take your time with those, winding those inductors, because that is probably the most difficult bit of the entire build. And catch you next week.